Nobody on Maplewood Drive in Columbus, Ohio could have predicted that a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning would end up changing their entire neighborhood forever. There were no signs, no warnings, no feeling in the air that something extraordinary was coming. It was just a morning, cool and quiet and smelling faintly of cut grass and distant rain, the kind of morning that arrives without fanfare and asks nothing of you except to pour your coffee and ease slowly into the day. Sandra Hayes was doing exactly that. She stood at her kitchen counter in her worn blue bathrobe, the one with the frayed left cuff she kept meaning to replace and never did, pressing her palms flat against the countertop and watching the coffee drip into the pot with the particular patience of a woman who had been awake since 5:30 and was not yet fully human. The kitchen radio was playing softly, an old country song she half recognized but couldn't name, and the morning light was coming in through the window above the sink in long, golden bars that stretched across the tile floor and made the whole room look warmer than it actually was. From the living room came the sound of Lily. Lily Hayes, 2 years and 4 months old, was engaged in what Sandra privately called her morning engineering project, an ambitious construction of colored wooden blocks that inevitably ended the same way every single day. Lily would build the tower as high as her arms could reach, study it for a long, serious moment with the focused expression of someone reviewing architectural blueprints, and then knock it down with one deliberate swipe and laugh like it was the funniest thing that had ever happened in the history of the world. Sandra could hear the careful, rhythmic click of block being placed on block, and she smiled without turning around. That sound, small and steady and full of purpose, was one of her favorite sounds in the world. Outside, Rex was on patrol. Their German Shepherd had turned 3 years old in January, and in those 3 years he had become so much more than a pet. He was the 4th member of the Hayes family in every sense that mattered. He slept at the foot of their bed. He sat beside Lily's high chair at mealtimes, patient and hopeful, accepting the pieces of banana and soft bread she occasionally dropped, or deliberately handed to him with the quiet dignity of someone receiving a gift. He greeted Tom every evening at the front door with a joy so complete and physical that Tom usually ended up sitting on the entryway floor just to properly receive it. And every single morning, without exception, Rex performed his patrol. It was a serious business, this patrol. Rex approached it with the full weight of professional responsibility. He moved along the fence line with his broad nose sweeping low across the grass, cataloging every scent that had drifted into his territory overnight: the neighbor's tabby cat, a raccoon that had passed through sometime around 3 in the morning, the ghost of a delivery driver who had cut across the corner of the yard the previous afternoon. He noted each one with a careful, methodical sniff, and then he moved on. He rounded the far corner of the yard. He checked the gate on the east side. He doubled back along the flower beds Sandra had planted last spring, the ones he had learned, after one very memorable incident, were not for digging. Sandra watched him through the kitchen window while she waited for her coffee. He was beautiful, she thought, not for the first time and not for the last. There was something about a German Shepherd moving with purpose across open ground, the fluid, effortless stride, the way the morning light caught the gold and black of his coat, the perfectly upright ears rotating like small radar dishes at every sound, that never got old. Tom sometimes joked that Rex moved like he knew he was handsome and wanted to make sure everyone had time to appreciate it. Sandra always laughed, but privately she thought it was less about vanity and more about confidence. Rex simply knew exactly who he was and what his job was, and he did both completely, every single day. The coffee finished, Sandra poured her cup. From the living room came the magnificent crash of the block tower meeting its end, followed immediately by Lily's laugh, that full, uninhibited, completely joyful sound that started somewhere deep in her small chest and filled whatever room it entered like sunlight filling a jar. Sandra laughed too, quietly into her coffee cup. It was a good morning, One of those mornings that feels almost too comfortable, too peaceful, too exactly right. The kind you notice while they're happening and feel grateful for, which is a rare and lovely thing. Sandra took her first sip of coffee. She looked back out the window at Rex, who had completed his loop of the yard and was now standing near the east side gate with his nose lifted, scenting something on the breeze with extraordinary interest. She watched him take one step toward the gate, then another. She noticed the way his tail had gone still, not dropped, not tucked, just arrested mid-wag in that particular way that meant his entire attention had been swallowed by something his nose was telling him. She thought nothing of it. Rex found interesting smells every morning. It was his nature, his joy, his purpose. She looked away. She took another sip of coffee. She listened to Lily begin rebuilding her tower in the next room. The small, careful clicks starting again from the beginning with total cheerful commitment. And then the sound came. It didn't start as a scream. It started as something worse, a single, high, sharp yelp of pure shock, the sound of an animal that has just discovered something has gone terribly wrong. And then it rose. It rose fast and it rose hard, climbing from shock into panic into something so raw and desperate that it didn't sound like Rex anymore. It sounded like an alarm, like a siren, like the audible version of a red light flashing in a dark room. Sandra's coffee cup hit the floor before she even decided to drop it. She was through the back door in seconds. She had no idea that the most breathtaking, most heartbreaking, most beautiful moment of her entire life was already walking barefoot across the living room floor behind her, small and unhurried and completely unafraid, heading toward the back door with both arms already reaching forward. 3 houses down from the Hayes property, at the far end of Maplewood Drive, where the street curved gently toward the old oak tree that had been there longer than any of the houses around it. Retired firefighter Bob Greer was having the best morning of his week. Retirement, Bob had decided, was the finest invention in human history. After 31 years of early alarms, cold coffee, and running toward things that everyone else was running away from, he had earned the right to do absolutely whatever he wanted at whatever hour he wanted without explanation or apology to anyone. And what Bob Greer wanted on this particular Tuesday morning was bacon. Not the thin, limp, sad kind of bacon that came out of a microwave. Real bacon. Thick-cut, hickory-smoked, lay it flat on a cast-iron grill grate over real charcoal bacon. The kind that took time and attention and produced a smell that Bob was fairly certain could qualify as a public service. He had the grill going by 6:50 in the morning, charcoal already glowing orange at the edges, the first strips just beginning to sizzle and pop with that low, rhythmic sound that meant everything was right with the world. The smoke rose in a thin, gorgeous column above his fence. It drifted east. It crossed over the Pattersons' yard, slipped past the Nuyens' rose bushes, floated over the hedge that separated number 42 from number 44, curled around the corner of the old maple at the edge of the Hayes property. And then, as if guided by some mischievous and invisible hand, threaded itself directly through the ornate iron bars of the decorative metal gate on the east side of the Hayes backyard, and arrived, with extraordinary precision, at the exact location of Rex's nose. Now, it is important to understand something about Rex's nose. A German Shepherd's sense of smell is, by scientific measurement, approximately 10,000 times more powerful than a human's. Where Sandra smelled coffee that morning, Rex smelled the specific farm in Guatemala where those beans had been grown, the particular hands that had sorted them, the precise temperature at which they had been roasted. Where Tom smelled fresh-cut grass on a Sunday afternoon, Rex smelled every individual blade, every insect that had passed over them, every molecule of soil beneath. Rex's nose was not merely a tool. It was a superpower. It was his primary way of understanding and navigating and experiencing the entire world around him. And Bob Greer's bacon hit that superpower like a freight train. Rex had been on the far side of the yard, completing the final stretch of his morning patrol along the flower beds when the smell reached him. He stopped walking instantly. Both ears swiveled forward. His tail, which had been swinging in its usual easy morning arc, went completely, perfectly still. Every muscle in his 78-pound body locked into total focus. He lifted his nose higher, pulling the scent in deeper, processing it with the full magnificent power of that extraordinary instrument. Hickory smoke, rendered fat, caramelizing protein, the specific, primal, irresistible smell of meat cooking over fire, a smell so ancient and so deeply coded into the animal brain that it bypassed every other thought Rex had ever had and spoke directly to something far older and far more fundamental. He turned toward the gate. He crossed the yard at a trot, nose still lifted, following the scent trail the way a river follows gravity, inevitably, completely, with no possibility of going any other direction. The smell was coming from beyond the gate, from the space on the other side of those iron bars, where the world continued past the boundaries of his yard and offered, apparently, something extraordinary. Rex reached the gate and pressed his nose against the bars. The smell was stronger here, richer, almost unbearably good. He pushed his nose through the gap between two of the bars and inhaled deeply. Better. He pushed a little further, angling his head sideways to get his snout through. The bars were ornate, curled, and decorative at the top, spaced widely enough to look elegant but designed with the assumption that nothing particularly large would be trying to pass between them. Rex's snout fit through easily. His lower jaw followed. He pushed a little more, tilting his head at the angle that felt most natural, and his skull wide at the brow, thick with the distinctive ridge that gave German shepherds their noble, serious profile, slid forward between the bars. He was through, or rather his head was through. He stretched his neck as far as it would go, nose working furiously, pulling in that incredible smell from 3 houses away with every breath. His tail had resumed wagging fast and low, the specific wag that meant he had found something deeply, personally satisfying. He stayed like that for a long, happy moment. And then Bob Greer flipped his bacon, and the fresh wave of smell that released into the morning air was so magnificent, so overwhelmingly good, that Rex instinctively tried to take one more step forward to get even closer. The bars stopped him. He pulled back, just a natural, reflexive backward shift of weight, the kind of movement that should have simply reversed what he'd done coming in. It didn't. The same geometry that had allowed his head to angle through going forward now worked directly against him going back. The wide brow that had slipped between the bars with a careful tilt now caught on both sides simultaneously. The thick muscle of his neck, pressed forward against the lower bar, created a leverage that had nowhere to go. Rex pulled back with more intention. The bars held. He twisted his head left. The right side of his skull pressed harder into the iron. He twisted right. The left side caught. He lurched forward, thinking perhaps he could complete the movement in the direction he'd started, but the bars were spaced too narrowly for his full neck to follow, and that option closed instantly. Rex went still for one suspended, terrible moment. In that moment, something shifted behind his eyes. The happy, tail-wagging, bacon-chasing dog was replaced by something older and more frightened. His ears, which had been forward and alert, flattened. His breathing, which had been easy and rhythmic, quickened. He tried again, backward, then forward, then a full-body twist that put every pound of his strength behind it, and the gate didn't move. Not even slightly. Those bars, sunk deep into a concrete footer and old as the house itself, were utterly, completely, terrifyingly immovable. And Rex began to panic. It started in his chest, a rapid, escalating hammering that Sandra would have recognized if she could have heard it, because it was the same rhythm as her own heart in the moment a moment later when his voice broke open across the morning. The whimper came first. High, thin, confused, the sound of an animal that cannot understand what is happening to it. Then it grew. It grew the way a small fire grows when it finds good fuel, fast, consuming, unstoppable. The whimper became a yelp. The yelp became a bark. The bark became a sound that was something beyond barking, a raw, full-throated, desperate cry that carried across the Hayes backyard, over the fence, past the flower beds, through the kitchen window, and directly into Sandra's chest like a stone thrown through glass. Rex was throwing his entire body against the bars now, lunging, twisting, scrabbling his back legs against the earth until the grass tore up in dark chunks beneath him. Every movement tightened the trap. Every struggle wedged his skull a fraction more firmly between the bars. But panic doesn't listen to logic, and Rex was well past logic now. He was in that deep, animal place where there is only the trap and the desperate, screaming need to be free of it. 3 houses down, Bob Greer flipped his bacon a second time. The smoke continued to drift east. And across the yard, the back door of the Hayes house burst open. Sandra Hayes had been a mother for 2 years and 4 months, and in that time she had developed the particular kind of hearing that only mothers possess. A hearing that operates on frequencies beyond the normal range, that can detect the specific cry of her own child in a room full of noise, that wakes her from deep sleep at the softest sound of distress from down the hallway. It is not a skill that is learned. It is something that arrives the moment a child is placed in your arms for the first time and rewires everything, the ears, the heart, the nervous system, permanently and completely. That hearing was what got her to the back door so fast. She didn't think. She didn't process. She didn't set her coffee cup down carefully or slip on her shoes or grab her phone from the counter. Her body simply moved, a pure, unmediated response to a sound that every instinct she possessed classified as emergency. And she was through the kitchen, across the small mudroom, and hitting the back door handle at full speed before her conscious mind had fully caught up with what was happening. The morning air hit her like a cold hand. She took the 2 back steps in one stride and landed on the damp grass in her bare feet and looked toward the east gate. And stopped. The image in front of her was so wrong, so jarringly out of place in the familiar landscape of her own backyard, that her brain genuinely struggled to process it for a full second. Rex, her beautiful, confident, patrol-the-yard-like-he-owns-it Rex, was pinned against the gate with his head locked between the iron bars, and he was throwing himself backward with everything he had. His back legs were churning the ground into torn mud. His powerful shoulders were bunching and releasing in violent, desperate surges. His whole body was twisting from side to side in great, lurching arcs that shook the gate in its frame without moving it even a fraction of an inch. And the sound coming from him, that raw, breaking, awful sound, was unlike anything Sandra had ever heard from him in 3 years. She ran. She covered the distance across the yard faster than she knew she could run, her bare feet hitting the cold, wet grass in long strides, and she reached him and threw both arms around his heaving body, without a second of hesitation. She pressed herself against his side, feeling the frantic, jackhammer rhythm of his heart against her forearms, feeling the heat radiating from his straining muscles, feeling the shudder that ran through his whole body with every desperate lunge. Rex, her voice came out low and steady, which surprised her because nothing inside her felt low or steady at all. Rex, stop. Stop moving, I've got you. I'm right here, I've got you. He couldn't hear her. Or rather, he heard her because Rex always heard Sandra the same way she always heard Lily, but he was somewhere beyond responding. The panic had him fully now, had swallowed him the way deep water swallows something heavy, and Sandra's voice, which had always been enough to bring him back from the edge of anything, was not enough this morning. She pressed her cheek against his neck anyway. She kept talking. Her hands moved over him, trying to find the geometry of the problem, trying to understand with her fingers what her eyes were already telling her. She found the bars on either side of his skull. She found the precise, awful way his brow ridge had caught above the horizontal bar while his neck was pressed hard against the bar below. She understood immediately, with the sick clarity of a problem that reveals itself all at once, that there was no simple solution here. This was not a matter of angling his head the right way. The bars were decorative iron, solid, old, set in concrete, and they had him as surely as a steel trap. She stood up and looked at the gate with her hands on her hips and her mind racing. Tom. She needed Tom. But Tom was 38 minutes away on a good day, closer to 50 in morning traffic, and every minute Rex spent throwing himself against those bars was a minute he could injure himself further, strain a muscle, cut his skin on the iron edge, or worse, wedge himself tighter until the pressure on his throat became something genuinely dangerous. She looked at the gate again. The concrete footer at the base was old but solid. The bars themselves were at least 3/4 of an inch thick. She grabbed 2 bars with both hands and pulled with everything she had. They didn't move. She hadn't expected them to move, but she needed to try. She needed tools, a lubricant, something to reduce the friction between Rex's skull and the iron long enough to ease him backward. She thought of the garage. Tom had WD-40 in there somewhere. She was almost certain of it. But the garage was on the other side of the house, accessible through the interior, and getting there and back would take 3 minutes she wasn't sure she had. She looked at Rex again. He was still fighting the bars with everything he had, and the ground beneath his back feet was completely torn up now, bare dirt showing through the destroyed grass in a wide, raw circle. Her hands were shaking when she grabbed her phone. She pulled up the dial pad and pressed 911 with a finger that wasn't entirely steady and lifted the phone to her ear. It rang once, twice. The dispatcher picked up on the third ring, a calm, professional female voice that said, 911, what is your emergency? Sandra opened her mouth to answer and heard the back door. The sound was so small, so quiet. Just the soft, familiar creak of the screen door swinging open on its hinges, a sound she heard 20 times a day, a sound so ordinary she usually didn't register it at all. But in this moment, in this context, that small sound hit Sandra Hayes like a bucket of ice water dropped from a great height. Because Lily was in the house. Lily, who was 2 years and 4 months old. Lily, who still needed help navigating the back steps. Lily, who had never in her short life encountered Rex in any state other than calm, playful, and completely in control of himself. Lily, who had absolutely no way of understanding that the animal at the gate right now was not the Rex she knew. That panic had temporarily replaced everything gentle and familiar about him, with something raw and unpredictable and frightened enough to act on pure instinct. Sandra spun around. Lily was already through the door. Both small bare feet were planted on the top back step, and her dark curly hair was wild from sleep, and her pink strawberry pajamas were slightly twisted from the way she'd been sitting on the rug. She had one hand on the door frame for balance. Her eyes, those big, dark, impossibly calm eyes, were fixed on Rex with an expression that Sandra could not immediately name. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't the excited recognition of a toddler spotting her dog. It was something quieter than all of those things. Something steadier. Lily, Sandra's voice came out sharper than she intended. Baby, go back inside. Go back inside right now. Lily looked at her mother for exactly 1 second. Then she looked back at Rex. And she stepped down off the step onto the grass. Lily, Sandra took 2 steps toward her daughter, phone still pressed to her ear, the dispatcher asking again if she was there, if everything was okay. Sandra's whole body was caught between 2 equally urgent, equally desperate imperatives, her dog at the gate and her daughter on the grass moving steadily, unhurriedly, in exactly the wrong direction. Ma'am, the dispatcher said again, are you there? Can you tell me your location? Sandra pressed the phone harder against her ear. Yes, I'm here. I'm at 47 Maplewood Drive in Columbus. I need help. My dog is stuck in a metal gate and he's panicking and I can't. Her voice cracked. She took a breath. I can't get him free and my daughter just came outside and She stopped talking. Because Lily had crossed half the yard already, and something about the way she was moving, that slow, deliberate, arms-extended walk, that quiet, continuous stream of soft baby sounds drifting back across the grass, had jammed every word Sandra Hayes possessed somewhere deep in her chest where she couldn't reach them. The dispatcher was asking something. Sandra couldn't hear it anymore. She could only watch her daughter walk toward the gate and feel something shift inside her chest that she would not find words for until much, much later. There is a particular kind of fear that belongs exclusively to parents. It is not the fear of dark rooms or high ledges or the sound of thunder in the middle of the night. It is something far more specific and far more consuming than any of those things. It is the fear that arrives in the space between seeing your child move toward danger and being able to stop them, that suspended, breathless, heart-stopping gap between the moment you recognize the threat and the moment your body closes the distance. It lasts only seconds. It feels like years. And in those seconds, the entire world narrows to a single point: your child moving, unaware, towards something that could hurt them. Sandra Hayes lived inside that fear for every step Lily took across the backyard. She was moving too. Her feet were already carrying her toward her daughter, cutting across the wet grass at an angle that she calculated, without consciously calculating anything, because this was pure instinct operating at full speed, would intercept Lily before she got too close to the gate. The phone was still pressed to her ear. The dispatcher was still talking. Sandra was aware of neither of these things in any meaningful way. She was aware only of Lily's small pink back moving steadily away from her, and of Rex still throwing himself against the bars in great shuddering lunges that made the entire gate frame shudder and clang, and of the distance between her daughter and that gate shrinking with every passing second. "Lily, stop!" Her voice came out low and urgent. "Baby, stop right there." Lily did not stop. She didn't speed up either. She didn't react to her mother's voice with the startled flinch of a child caught doing something she knows is wrong. She simply continued at exactly the pace she had set from the moment her bare feet touched the grass, slow, steady, unhurried, as though she had somewhere specific to be and had calculated exactly how long it would take her to get there, and found the answer perfectly satisfactory. Sandra was close now, close enough to reach out and touch her daughter's shoulder. She extended her hand. And something made her stop. She could not have explained it then, and she struggled to explain it for months afterward in every interview and conversation and quiet late-night moment of reflection that followed. It was not a rational decision. It was not the conclusion of any logical process. It was something beneath logic, something that operated in the same deep, wordless register as the hearing that had brought her flying through the back door 60 seconds ago. Something that said, with a clarity and a certainty that bypassed every arguing thought in her head, "Wait. Watch. Don't stop her." Sandra's hand dropped. She stood 3 feet behind her daughter, breathing hard, foam pressed to her cheek, and she watched. Lily was talking to Rex. That was the only word for it, even though the sounds coming from her were not words in any language that could be written down or translated. They were something older than language, a continuous, flowing, melodic stream of sound that rose and fell with the natural rhythm of speech, the rhythm of someone saying something important to someone they love deeply and trust completely. There were syllables in it. There were shapes that almost resolved into real words before curving away into something softer and more fundamental. There was a musicality to it that Sandra had heard before, in the dark of Lily's room in the middle of the night when Lily talked in her sleep. That same quality of sound that existed somewhere between language and song and pure human warmth. Rex heard it. Sandra saw the exact moment it reached him. She saw it in his ears first, those perfectly upright, radar-ish ears that had been flat against his skull with fear suddenly twitched, rotated, oriented themselves toward the sound of Lily's voice with the involuntary precision of a compass needle finding north. His body didn't stop moving yet. He was still too deep in the panic for that, but something in him had registered something familiar. Something that belonged to the world before the gate and the bars and the trap. something that was trying to remind him that not everything was danger. Lily was 10 feet away now, then 8, then 6. Sandra realized she had stopped breathing. The dispatcher said something. Sandra pressed the phone harder against her ear and whispered. She wasn't sure why she was whispering, only that it felt absolutely necessary. She's going to him. My daughter is walking to the dog. Please send someone. 47 Maplewood, please hurry, but just, she stopped, swallowed. Just give me a second. Lily reached the edge of the gate's shadow and stopped. Not because anything had stopped her. Not because she'd lost her nerve or reconsidered her direction. She stopped because she had arrived exactly where she intended to be, close enough to Rex that he could see her clearly, close enough that her voice would reach him without her needing to raise it, but not so close that she crowded him. She stood there for a moment, this 2-year-old girl in her pink strawberry pajamas, bare feet on the cold morning grass, dark curls lifting slightly in the morning breeze, and she looked at Rex. Really looked at him. With those big, dark, serious eyes that Sandra had always privately thought contained something ancient in them, some quality of seeing that went beyond what 2 years of life should have produced. Rex was still fighting the bars, still lurching, still making that awful, breaking sound. His eyes were rolling and wild, and his whole body was sheened with the effort of his struggle. Lily watched him for a long moment. And then she took one more step forward. Rex's eyes found her. It happened in the middle of one of his backward lunges, his body mid-movement, his muscles contracted, his whole frame angled away from the gate in a surge of desperate backward force. And then his eyes found Lily's face, and the lunge simply stopped. Not completed, not reversed, stopped, as though the signal from his brain to his muscles had been interrupted by something more important arriving on the same frequency. He looked at her. She looked at him. For a moment, just a moment, the yard was completely, utterly silent. Rex had stopped moving. His body was still angled backward mid-lunge, frozen in place, and the only sound was his ragged, rapid breathing and the distant sizzle of Bob Greer's bacon 3 houses down and Sandra's own heartbeat, which she could hear clearly in both ears. Lily took the last step. She closed the remaining distance between herself and Rex with that final, unhesitating step, and then she was right there, right in front of him, close enough that his warm, panicked breath moved her curls. She was level with his trapped face, eye to eye with him in a way that required no bending or reaching on either of their parts, because a 2-year-old girl and an 80-pound German shepherd with his head at gate height are, as it turns out, very nearly the same height when it matters. She lifted both hands. She placed her left hand flat against his cheek, not grabbing, not gripping, just placing, warm and light and completely without force, the way you might rest your hand against a wall to feel if the sun has warmed the stone. Her right hand went to his nose, cupped gently beneath it, not blocking his breath, just present, just there, just hers. And she began to hum. It was not a song. It was not a melody anyone in the world would have recognized. It was the same sound she made in her sleep, that deep, continuous, ancient-feeling vibration that seemed to come from somewhere in her chest that was older than she was. It was soft. It was steady. It did not waver or hesitate or change in response to anything Rex did. It simply continued, constant as a heartbeat, warm as a hand on a cold morning. Rex's ears, which had been flat slowly, so slowly rose. His breathing, which had been rapid and shallow and desperate, caught once, held, released in a long, shuddering breath that seemed to empty him of something, some tight, terrible thing he had been holding since the moment the gate closed around him. His eyes, still locked on Lily's face, lost the wild, rolling quality that had been in them since the panic took hold. They focused, steadied, became, with agonizing slowness, the eyes of Rex again, warm and brown and full of a recognition so complete it looked, from where Sandra stood 3 feet behind her daughter, almost like relief. Sandra Hayes put her free hand over her mouth. She felt the tears before she knew she was crying, felt them on her fingers before she felt them on her cheeks. And she stood there behind her 2-year-old daughter and completely fell apart in the quietest, most private way she had ever fallen apart in her life. Into her phone, barely above a whisper, she breathed 6 words. "She's calming him down. She's calming him down." The dispatcher on the other end of the line said nothing for a moment. Then, in a voice that had shifted from professional and measured to something considerably more human, she said, "Ma'am, how old is your daughter?" Sandra closed her eyes. "2," she whispered. "She just turned 2." There was another pause. "Help is on the way," the dispatcher said softly. "But I think your little girl might be doing just fine on her own." There are moments in life that don't feel like they belong to ordinary time. Not the big, scheduled moments, the graduations and weddings and birthdays that arrive with preparation and anticipation, and cameras already pointed in the right direction. Those moments belong to time just fine. They fit inside it neatly, begin and end on cue, and take their place in the orderly sequence of a life the way chapters take their place in a book. No, the moments that step outside of time are always the unexpected ones. The ones that arrive without announcement in the middle of a Tuesday morning in a backyard in Columbus, Ohio, while the coffee goes cold on the kitchen counter, and the bacon sizzles 3 houses down, and the rest of the world continues at its normal pace, completely unaware that something is happening on Maplewood Drive that will not be forgotten for a very long time. Sandra Hayes was standing in the middle of one of those moments. She knew it while it was happening. That was the extraordinary thing. She didn't have to look back later and recognize it. She recognized it in real time, standing 3 feet behind her daughter on the cold, wet grass in her bare feet and her frayed blue bathrobe. Phone pressed to her cheek, tears sliding quietly down her face. She recognized it the way you recognize a piece of music you've never heard before but somehow already know, with your whole body all at once, without any need for explanation. Lily had not moved since placing her hands on Rex's face. She stood exactly as she had positioned herself in that final, unhesitating step, close enough to Rex that the warmth of his breath was moving through her dark curls, both small hands resting against his face with that extraordinary lightness that somehow carried more weight than force ever could. Her left hand lay flat against his cheek. Her right hand cradled gently beneath his nose, and she hummed. The hum had not stopped. It continued with the same steady, unbroken quality it had carried from the first note, that low, warm, continuous vibration that seemed far too deep and far too sure to be coming from a 2-year-old's chest. It didn't speed up when Rex shifted. It didn't falter when he exhaled one of those long, shuddering breaths that moved through his whole body like a wave. It simply continued, patient and constant and completely, utterly calm. As though Lily had all the time in the world. As though there was nowhere else she needed to be and nothing else she needed to do except stand here, in this exact spot, and hum this exact sound, for exactly as long as it took. Rex was looking at her. That was what broke Sandra open the second time, deeper than the first, past the place where she could manage it quietly. Because Rex was not simply facing Lily the way a trapped animal faces the nearest thing in its field of vision. He was looking at her. There was intention in it. There was recognition. Those dark brown eyes, which 6 minutes ago had been rolling and wild and full of the particular blankness of an animal lost inside pure panic, were focused on Lily's face with an attention so complete and so specific that it looked, from where Sandra stood, almost like conversation. Like Rex was listening. Like somewhere beneath the fear and the adrenaline and the confusion of the bars and the trap and the desperate, exhausting struggle, some part of him had found the frequency Lily was broadcasting on, had locked onto it the way a ship's radio locks onto a lighthouse signal in a storm, and was holding on with everything he had. His breathing had changed. This was the thing Sandra kept coming back to in every retelling, in every interview, in every quiet conversation about that morning. The breathing. Because breathing is the most honest thing a frightened animal does. It is the thing that cannot be performed or managed or controlled. The thing that tells the true story of what is happening inside regardless of what the outside is doing. And Rex's breathing, which had been rapid and shallow and ragged with panic, was changing in a way that Sandra could see from 3 feet away. It was slowing. Not dramatically, not all at once. The way a storm slows gradually, reluctantly, 1 degree at a time, the wind dropping by small increments that you almost can't detect individually, but that add up over minutes to something unmistakable. Rex took a breath that was slightly less shallow than the one before it. Then another. His ribcage, which had been moving in rapid, stuttering expansions that barely filled his lungs, began to take in air more deeply. His shoulders, bunched up near his ears with the physical expression of his terror, dropped a fraction. Then another fraction. Lily kept humming. She had moved her forehead forward, Sandra realized. At some point in the last minute, Sandra couldn't have said exactly when, because time was behaving strangely and she was not tracking it with any precision. Lily had leaned forward the last inch and pressed her small forehead gently against Rex's. Not hard, not dramatically, just resting it there, the way you rest your forehead against a cold window on a hot day. The way you press your face into something familiar when you need to feel grounded. Forehead to forehead. A 2-year-old girl and an 80-pound German shepherd, eye to eye and brow to brow, in the middle of a Columbus backyard on a Tuesday morning while the world turned without them. Sandra made a sound she had never made before. She didn't know what to call it afterward. It wasn't a sob. It was quieter than a sob, more interior, more private. It was the sound of something structural giving way. The sound of a person discovering that their capacity for being moved by something has just been exceeded in a way they didn't know was possible. She pressed her free hand harder over her mouth and felt it tremble against her lips and stood there, and let the tears come because there was absolutely nothing else she could do. The dispatcher's voice in her ear said, "Ma'am, are you still there?" Sandra pulled in a breath, let it out slowly. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'm here, She stopped, started again. "My daughter." She put her forehead against his. She's 2 years old," and she put her forehead against his, and he's calming down. He's actually calming down. A pause from the dispatcher. Then softly, "Units are 4 minutes out, ma'am." Sandra nodded, even though no one could see her. 4 minutes. She looked at her daughter's small back, at the wild dark curls, at the pink strawberry pajamas, at the 2 small bare feet planted in the cold morning grass with a steadiness and a rootedness that Sandra had seen in very few adults in her entire life. She looked at Rex. His ears were up now, fully, properly upright in the way they sat when he was alert but not afraid. His eyes were still on Lily's face. The trembling that had been running through his body in continuous visible waves had subsided to occasional shivers, the kind that follow fear rather than the kind that belong to it. His tail, which had been clamped tight against his body since the panic took him, had moved, not wagging, not yet, but moved, lifted slightly from its tucked position, as though it was remembering what it was for. Lily had moved her left hand from his cheek. She was reaching up now, her small arm extending upward with the slight wobble of a toddler reaching for something at the limit of her range, and she placed her palm flat on top of Rex's head, between his ears, in the exact spot that Rex, in all his 3 years, had always loved most to be touched. The spot that made his eyes go soft and his jaw relax, and sometimes made him make that low, rumbling sound that was too gentle to be a growl and too quiet to be a bark. That particular Rex sound that the Hayes family had always called his purr. He made it now. It was barely audible, a low, deep, barely there vibration in his chest that Sandra felt rather than heard, felt it in the air between them, felt it in the soles of her bare feet through the ground, felt it in her sternum in the way that very low sounds resonate in the body before they reach the ears. But it was there. It was real. And it was the most beautiful sound Sandra Hayes had ever heard in her life, because she knew what it meant. It meant Rex was still in there. It meant the panic hadn't swallowed him whole. It meant that underneath all the fear and the struggle and the desperate animal confusion of the last 10 minutes, the dog they loved was still present, still accessible, still capable of being reached by the right voice, and the right touch, and the right small person standing in front of him with her forehead pressed to his and her hand between his ears and her heart, pointed directly at him like a compass needle pointing home. Sandra's legs went unreliable beneath her. She sat down on the grass, not gracefully, not by choice. Her legs simply stopped holding her up and she went down, landing in the damp grass in her bathrobe with her knees folded beneath her, phone still pressed to her ear, tears still coming, eyes still fixed on her daughter's small, straight, unwavering back. The dispatcher said the units were 2 minutes out. Sandra didn't answer. She was watching Lily hum. She was watching Rex breathe. She was watching a 2-year-old girl hold a frightened animal together with nothing but her hands and her voice, and whatever it is that lives in certain people. From birth, before experience, before the world has had a chance to teach them what to be afraid of, that allows them to walk toward fear without flinching, and simply, quietly, completely love it into stillness. Down the street a siren started, faint at first then growing. Lily didn't look up. Rex didn't move. The hum continued. And Sandra Hayes sat in the wet grass of her own backyard and understood, with the full and certain weight of a truth that lands only once in a lifetime, that she was watching something she would spend the rest of her life being grateful she had not looked away from. Captain David Morris had a system. Every emergency responder develops one eventually, a personal protocol, an internal architecture of calm that they build piece by piece over years of running toward the things that make everyone else run away. It is not the absence of emotion. Anyone who tells you that first responders feel nothing is wrong. It is something more sophisticated than that. It is the ability to feel everything and still function, to hold the weight of what you are seeing without letting it slow your hands or cloud your judgment, or pull you away from the thing that needs doing right now in this moment with these tools and this training and this crew. Captain Morris had been building his system for 16 years. It had held through house fires and car accidents and medical emergencies of every variety. It had held through the flood of 2019 that had taken out 6 basements on the east side of Columbus and required his crew to work for 31 hours without a real break. It had held through the night 3 years ago when they'd pulled a family of 4 from a burning building on Terrace Avenue and the youngest child, a little girl of about 5, had reached up and grabbed his hand in the smoke and held it all the way to the ambulance. His system had held through all of it. It did not hold through Lily Hayes. The call had come in at 7:14 as a standard animal rescue, dog with head entrapped in metal gate structure, owner on scene, animal in distress. Captain Morris had handled animal rescues more times than he could count. They were not, professionally speaking, the most complex calls in the rotation. You brought bolt cutters, you brought lubricant spray, you brought a calm voice and steady hands and the particular kind of patience that frightened animals require. And most of the time the job was done in under 20 minutes with no serious injuries to anyone involved. He had dispatched his crew with the efficient, practiced ease of someone who has done something so many times that it has become automatic. He had not told them to prepare for anything unusual. He had no reason to. The crew of Engine 12 arrived at 47 Maplewood Drive at 7:19, 5 minutes after the call, which was a good response time for that part of the city on a Tuesday morning. Captain Morris led them through the side gate at a purposeful trot, bolt cutters over his shoulder, rescue lubricant on his belt. His crew fanned out behind him in the standard approach formation. Firefighter Pete Dawson on his left with the secondary tool kit. Veteran paramedic Renee Washington on his right with the animal restraint equipment, just in case. Probationary firefighter Jake Sellers bringing up the rear, his first month on the crew, still learning to match the pace of people who had been doing this for years. They came through the gate ready. Captain Morris took 3 steps into the backyard and stopped. Pete Dawson, who had been watching his captain's back the way he always did on approach, saw the stop coming a half-second too late and walked into Morris hard enough to knock them both slightly sideways. He grabbed the fence post to steady himself and looked up to see what had stopped the captain dead in his tracks. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. There in the backyard of 47 Maplewood Drive, in the middle of the damp morning grass, sat a little girl. She was tiny. She was barefoot. She was wearing pink strawberry pajamas that were slightly damp at the hem from the grass. Her dark curly hair was wild and unbrushed and caught the early morning light in a way that made it look, from the gate, almost like a halo. She was sitting cross-legged on the ground directly in front of the iron gate, and she was holding the face of an 80-pound German shepherd in both of her hands with a tenderness so complete and so natural that it looked like something from a painting. The kind of painting that gets hung in a museum and makes people stop walking and stand very still and feel something they couldn't name before they walked in. The dog was motionless. This was the thing that hit Captain Morris second, after the initial shock of the image itself. The dog, the panicked, entrapped, distressed animal they had been dispatched to rescue, was completely, utterly, impossibly still. His eyes were half closed. His breathing was deep and slow and even. His tail, which based on the torn-up ground around the gate had been working hard against the earth not long ago, was resting quietly against the grass. His enormous body, which should by every reasonable expectation have been still fighting the bars with desperate animal energy, was instead draped with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to animals and people, who have been talked down from a ledge by someone they trust completely. He looked, Captain Morris would tell reporters the following day, like a dog that had simply decided to take a nap, against a gate, with his head between 2 iron bars, as if this were the most natural resting position in the world. Lily was still humming. Captain Morris heard it from 10 feet away, that low, continuous, steady sound that she had apparently been producing without interruption since she'd first walked across the grass to Rex. Up close it was even more extraordinary than Sandra had been able to convey on the phone. It wasn't loud. It wasn't performative. It had the quality of something entirely unconscious, the way people hum while they're doing dishes or folding laundry, without any awareness that they're making sound at all. Except that this particular hum, coming from this particular 2-year-old in this particular context, carried something in it that made the hair on the back of Captain Morris's neck stand up in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He turned to look at his crew. Renee Washington, 10 years on the job, seen more in a decade than most people see in a lifetime, not a woman given to visible displays of emotion in professional settings, had her right hand pressed flat against the center of her chest. Her eyes were moving between Lily and Rex with an expression that Morris had never seen on her face in all the time they'd worked together. Something open, something unguarded. Something that looked, on Renee Washington's usually composed face, startlingly like wonder. Jake Sellers, 4 weeks out of the academy, had simply stopped moving entirely. He was standing with his equipment bag hanging from one hand, his arm slightly extended as though he'd been in the process of bringing it forward when something had interrupted the signal from his brain to his muscles. He was staring at Lily with the expression of someone watching a magic trick, not the flashy, stagey kind, but the kind that makes you quietly revise your understanding of what is possible. Pete Dawson had both hands on the gate behind him, steadying himself. Nobody spoke. Captain Morris understood, with the particular clarity that sometimes arrives in extraordinary moments, that speaking would be wrong. Not tactically wrong, not in the sense that it might startle Rex or disrupt Lily's concentration. Wrong in a deeper sense. The kind of wrong that applies when you walk into a church in the middle of a service, or come upon someone in the middle of a private grief, or find yourself present at something that is doing just fine without your intervention and deserves to be witnessed rather than managed. He held up one hand behind him. His crew read the signal instantly. Everyone stopped. Everyone waited. For 30 seconds, which felt, in the specific time dilation of that backyard on that morning, considerably longer, the 4 firefighters of Engine 12 stood at the edge of the scene and simply watched a little girl hold a frightened dog together with her hands and her voice, and whatever extraordinary thing she had been born with that allowed her to do this. Then Captain Morris lowered his hand slowly and turned to his crew. He kept his voice at barely above a whisper. "Renee, lubricant, Pete's secondary position on the right bar. Jake," he paused, looked at his probationary firefighter, saw the young man's eyes still glistening at the edges in a way that Jake was clearly hopping nobody had noticed. Morris made a decision. "Jake, you stay back and give them space. Watch and learn. You will not see this again in your career." Jake nodded. He swallowed hard. "Yes, sir," he whispered. Renee moved first, stepping forward with the practiced silence of someone who has learned to move through distress without adding to it. She crossed the grass in a wide, careful arc, keeping herself low and slow, making no sudden movements, producing no sounds that didn't need to be produced. She reached the gate 2 feet to Lily's right and crouched down to work. Lily did not look up. Rex did not move. The hum continued. Captain Morris crouched beside Renee and began the assessment, running his hands along the bars with careful, practiced efficiency, identifying the precise geometry of the entrapment, calculating the angle of force required, planning the extraction with the methodical precision of someone for whom this kind of problem is normally routine. Normally. Nothing about this morning was normal. Because every 30 seconds or so, Captain David Morris, 16 years on the job, holder of the department's commendation for valor, a man who had held his system together through things that would have broken most people, found his eyes drifting away from the bars and the bolt cutters and the technical problem in front of him, back to the small girl sitting in the grass with her forehead pressed against the dog's. And each time they drifted there, he had to take a breath and look away again. Because if he looked too long, his system stopped working. And he had a job to do. He looked at Renee. She looked at him. They had worked together long enough to communicate in the shorthand of people who have been through things together, and what passed between them in that look required no words. Morris nodded. Renee uncapped the lubricant spray. They got to work. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a crowd of people who are collectively holding their breath. It is not the silence of emptiness or indifference. It is the opposite of those things. It is a silence so full of feeling, so dense with the weight of what every person present is carrying inside them in that moment, that it has a physical quality, a pressure in the air, a thickness, a sense that the atmosphere itself has leaned in to pay attention. It is the silence of a concert hall in the last second before the music begins. The silence of a hospital waiting room when a doctor appears in the doorway. The silence of 27 people standing along a fence line on Maplewood Drive in Columbus, Ohio, watching a little girl hold a frightened dog still while 4 firefighters work quietly around her. That was the silence on Maplewood Drive at 7:23 on a Tuesday morning. It had started with Patricia Odom. Patricia had been awake since 5:30. She was always awake since 5:30, one of the particular gifts of being 67 years old that nobody warns you about when you're younger. And she had been at her kitchen window with her second cup of tea when the siren started. In 31 years on Maplewood Drive, she had developed an instinct for the difference between a siren passing through and a siren stopping, and this one was stopping. She had her coat on before the engine had fully pulled to the curb. She was not alone. Gary and Michelle Patterson from number 44 had come out together, Gary still in his work clothes from the night shift he'd just returned from, Michelle in her robe with her hair still pinned up. The Nguyen family from number 40, both parents and their teenage son Marcus, who had his phone out but wasn't filming, just holding it, like he'd reached for it automatically, and then found he didn't actually want to put anything between himself and what he was seeing. Bob Greer from number 34 had turned off his grill and come down the street still wearing his grilling apron, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who has connected his bacon to a crisis and is quietly reckoning with that. Old Mr. Haverford from the corner house, who was 81 years old and had once told Sandra Hayes that he'd stopped going out of his way to witness things because he'd already seen everything worth seeing. Mr. Haverford was at the fence. They had gathered without organizing, without anyone calling anyone, the way neighbors gather in moments of shared urgency, drawn by sirens and instinct, and the particular pull of something happening close to home that might require bearing witness. They stood along the fence line of the Hayes property and they watched. And they were silent. Inside the yard, Captain Morris and Renee Washington had been working the bars for 4 minutes with a care and precision that both of them would later describe as the most careful work of their professional lives. Not because the technical challenge was the greatest they had faced. It wasn't. The entrapment was serious but manageable, a matter of the right lubrication applied to the right points combined with a specific angle of pressure, applied slowly and steadily, until the geometry that had closed around Rex's skull could be persuaded to reverse itself. The care came from something else. It came from Lily. She was still there, still cross-legged on the grass, still humming, still holding Rex's face in her hands with that extraordinary, unbroken tenderness that had stopped 4 firefighters in their tracks when they walked through the gate. She had not moved significantly since they'd begun working. She had not looked up at them, had not spoken to them, had not acknowledged their presence in any overt way. She was simply there, a small, steady, immovable presence at the center of everything, and her presence had imposed itself on every decision Morris and Washington made about how to do this job. Every movement they made was slower because of her. Every adjustment they made to the bars was gentler because of her. Every word they exchanged, and there were very few, conducted in the near whisper they had maintained since entering the yard, was quieter because of her. Probationary firefighter Jake Sellers was still standing where Captain Morris had positioned him, back from the action, watching. He had stopped trying to manage his expression. There was nobody looking at him. Everyone's attention was on the gate and the girl and the dog. And so he stood in the morning light at the edge of the yard and let his face do what it needed to do, which turned out to involve a significant amount of blinking and one very deep, very slow breath that he took with his eyes closed and his head tilted slightly back. At the fence, the crowd waited. Morris nodded to Washington. Washington repositioned her hands on the right bar, fingers wrapped around the iron just above where Lily's line of sight would catch them if she looked up. Morris applied the last careful spray of lubricant along the left bar, working it down with practiced fingers, coating the contact points between Rex's skull and the iron with a thin, even layer that would, if the angle was right and the pressure was applied correctly, allow the geometry to work in their favor for once. He looked at Pete Dawson, positioned on the opposite side. Dawson gave him a single nod, ready. Morris looked at Rex. Rex was looking at Lily. He had not looked away from Lily's face since the moment she had placed her forehead against his, had not registered the arrival of the firefighters in any significant way, had not reacted to the sounds of their equipment or the proximity of their hands to his head. His entire universe, in this moment, had contracted to the size of one small girl's face, and he was holding onto it with everything he had, the way a person lost in fog holds onto the sound of a voice calling them home. Morris took a breath. "On 3, he murmured, slow and steady, no sudden movement. Washington and Dawson nodded. 1. At the fence, Patricia Odom gripped the top rail with both hands. 2. Sandra Hayes, still sitting in the wet grass 5 feet behind her daughter, pressed both hands flat against the ground on either side of her, as though bracing herself against something. 3. The movement was slow, deliberate, a carefully coordinated application of outward pressure on both bars simultaneously, combined with a gentle forward guidance on Rex's neck that encouraged the geometry to open rather than close. For one long, suspended second, nothing happened. The bars held. The crowd at the fence held its breath. Sandra stopped breathing entirely. And then, with a sound that was somehow both significant and anticlimactic, a soft, low sliding sound that nobody who heard it would ever forget, Rex's head came free. He stumbled back 2 steps, shook his great head once, twice, the heavy ears flying and the whole skull swinging in that characteristic German shepherd way that under any other circumstances would have made everyone present laugh. He sneezed, once, forcefully, with the full-body commitment that only dogs bring to sneezing. He blinked. He looked around with the slightly dazed expression of someone who has just woken from a very intense dream and is still locating themselves in the waking world. And then he turned to Lily. He didn't rush. He didn't bound toward her the way he might have on an ordinary morning when she came into the backyard, and he was overjoyed to see her. He walked to her, 4 slow, deliberate steps, and then he lowered his great head and placed it in her lap with a weight and a completeness, and a trust so absolute that it was not so much an action as a statement. A declaration. You held me together. I'm giving myself back to you. Lily looked down at him. She stopped humming. For a moment she just looked at him, studying his face with those serious dark eyes the way she studied everything she loved, with total attention and total presence. Then she smiled. And then she laughed that laugh, the full one, the real one, the one that started in her belly and had no performance in it whatsoever, the one that sounded like pure, uncomplicated joy poured into sound, and she threw both arms around Rex's neck and buried her face in his fur. The crowd at the fence came apart. It did not come apart in a single clean wave. It came apart the way people come apart when something has been building inside them for longer than they realized, in pieces, in different ways, all at once. Gary Patterson made a sound that he would later describe to his wife as definitely not crying, just you know. Michelle Patterson did not bother with that distinction and wept openly and without apology. Marcus Nguyen, who was 17 and had been raised to believe that maintaining composure was a virtue, lasted approximately 4 seconds after Lily's laugh before he turned away from the fence and pressed his forehead against his mother's shoulder. His mother wrapped both arms around him and held on. Bob Greer took off his grilling apron, folded it carefully, and pressed it against his face. Mr. Haverford from the corner house, 81 years old, had seen everything worth seeing, gripped the fence with one hand and put the other over his heart, and stood very still and very straight, and let 2 tears run down the side of his face without doing anything about them. Later, when the news reporter came to interview the neighbors, Mr. Haverford would say only one thing about that morning, and he would say it in a voice that had no wobble in it because he had had 81 years to develop a voice that didn't wobble. He would say, "I was wrong, I hadn't seen everything." And Patricia Odom, 67 years old, 31 years on Maplewood Drive, the woman who had watched this street through marriages and divorces and births and deaths and graduations and moves, and every ordinary, extraordinary thing that happens when people live alongside each other for decades. Patricia Odom gripped the top rail of that fence with both hands and wept with the full, unguarded, whole-body honesty of someone who has just seen something so purely, simply good that every wall they have ever built against feeling too much has been taken down in a single moment. She wept for Rex, safe and free. She wept for Lily, barefoot and fearless and laughing into her dog's fur. She wept for Sandra, sitting in the wet grass with her hands pressed to the ground and her face turned upward. She wept, perhaps, for herself, for 31 years of mornings on this street, and for the extraordinary gift of being present for this one. Inside the yard, Captain David Morris was packing up his equipment with hands that were not entirely steady. He did not comment on this. Neither did anyone else. The recording went live at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. It was released by the Columbus Police Department's Public Affairs Office as a routine matter, a standard procedure that applied to all 911 calls once the incident had been cleared and the relevant parties had given consent. The officer who uploaded it to the department's public portal did so between sips of his morning coffee, typed a brief descriptive title into the metadata field, and moved on to the next item on his administrative checklist. He had no particular expectation that anyone beyond the immediate local news cycle would pay it much attention. Animal rescue calls were heartwarming. People liked them. They got a few shares, a few comments, maybe a brief segment on the local evening broadcast. Then the news cycle moved on, the way it always does, to the next thing. He was wrong. By 9:45, the recording had been shared 6,000 times. By 11, it had crossed 30,000. By 2 in the afternoon, the Columbus Police Department's social media coordinator, a 26-year-old named Angela Torres who had taken the job 18 months ago and had never in that time dealt with anything remotely approaching viral, was sitting at her desk watching the share counter move in real time with the particular expression of someone watching a speedometer climb past every number they were prepared for and keep going. By midnight, the recording had been shared 114,000 times across 4 platforms. By Thursday morning, it was everywhere. It is difficult to explain, to someone who has not heard it, exactly what it is about that recording that reaches into people the way it does. The audio quality is not exceptional. It is a 911 call, captured on standard emergency dispatch equipment, with the ambient sounds of a Columbus backyard bleeding through at irregular intervals. Rex can be heard in the background, his distress gradually transforming over the course of the call into something quieter. The dispatcher's voice is professional and measured, the practiced calm of someone trained to be the still point in other people's storms. But Sandra's voice is the thing. It is not the voice she uses when she is managing a situation. It is not the voice of a woman who has gotten herself together and is functioning under pressure and handling things competently. It is the voice of a mother who has been completely undone by something she was not prepared for, stripped of every layer of composure and competence and adult armor, by the sight of her 2-year-old daughter walking barefoot across a cold morning lawn toward a panicking dog with both arms outstretched and absolutely no fear in her body whatsoever. It is the voice of someone witnessing grace. The moment that stopped the world, the moment that got clipped and shared and quoted and replayed in living rooms and break rooms and firehouses and kindergarten classrooms across the entire country, was 47 seconds into the recording. Sandra's voice drops to barely above a whisper. You can hear her breath catch before she speaks. And then she says, in a voice that is trying to be steady and cannot quite get there. She's calming him down. My 2-year-old baby just walked up and she's calming him down. He stopped. He just completely stopped. A pause. Then the dispatcher, in a voice that has shifted from professional to something considerably more human. How old is your daughter, ma'am? Another pause, longer, the sound of Sandra breathing. 2, she whispers. She just turned 2. That was the 47 seconds that broke the country open. Radio hosts played it and couldn't finish their segments. A morning show host in New York City, a woman known professionally for her ability to maintain composure through anything, who had interviewed heads of state and disaster survivors and people in the full extremity of human experience without losing her broadcast voice, played the clip on air Thursday morning and sat in silence for 4 full seconds afterward before she could speak. When she did speak, she said only, "I'm sorry," to her audience and pressed her fingers briefly against her eyes. The clip of her reaction was shared almost as widely as the original recording. A firehouse in Detroit, Engine Company 23, 12 men and women who had collectively seen more of the ragged edge of human experience than most people encounter in several lifetimes, printed the transcript of the call and pinned it to their bulletin board beneath a handwritten note that said simply, "This is why." Nobody specified what it was why of. Nobody needed to. A kindergarten teacher in Portland named Ms. Elaine Marsh read the story to her class of 22 5-year-olds on Thursday afternoon, having spent 20 minutes beforehand carefully editing it into language appropriate for small children. When she finished reading, a boy named Owen, who sat in the third row and was generally more interested in dinosaurs than in stories about dogs, raised his hand and said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of a 5-year-old who has just understood something important, she wasn't scared because she loved him. Ms. Marsh told this to a reporter the following week. The reporter put it in her article. The article was shared 240,000 times. Owen's mother printed his quote, framed it, and hung it in his bedroom, where it remained for years. Tom Hayes had arrived home from work on Tuesday morning at 8:14, 41 minutes after Sandra's call, having driven with a focused urgency that he would not discuss in detail with reporters because it involved speeds he preferred not to have on record. He came through the side gate at a near run, already calling Sandra's name, his mind cycling through every version of what he might find. He found Sandra sitting in the wet grass of the backyard, with her knees folded beneath her and her bathrobe damp at the hem, and her face carrying the particular expression of someone who has been through something that has permanently rearranged the furniture of their interior life. He found Rex lying stretched out on the grass with his chin resting on Lily's knee, his eyes half closed, his tail moving in the slow, contented sweep of a dog who has been through something and come out the other side of it into somewhere warm and safe. He found Lily sitting beside Rex with one hand resting on his back and the other reaching up toward a passing butterfly with the effortless redirection of a 2-year-old, whose emotional processing operates at a speed and efficiency that adults can only envy. Tom Hayes sat down on the back steps. He put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. He stayed that way for a long time. Later, in the television interview that aired the following Tuesday, Sandra and Tom side by side on a studio couch, Lily between them in a new dress, Rex inexplicably having been approved by the producers to attend and currently occupying most of the floor space in front of the couch. Tom was asked what went through his mind when he arrived home that morning and saw his daughter sitting in the grass with Rex. He took a breath. He looked at Lily, who was at that moment attempting to remove her left shoe for reasons known only to herself, and appeared completely uninterested in the national television program being built around her. He said, in a voice that had clearly been through several recent rehearsals of trying to hold itself together, and was doing its best, "I always knew she was something. From the day she was born, there was just something in her, something steady, something that was already there, already formed before the world had a chance to put its hands on it." He stopped, cleared his throat. "But I don't think I understood it until that morning. I don't think I understood what it actually was." The interviewer asked him what he thought it was. Tom looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at Tom. And Tom Hayes looked back at the camera and said, simply and without any further elaboration, "It's love without fear. That's all it is. She doesn't know yet that love is supposed to come with conditions and calculations and self-protection. She just loves, all the way, every time, without checking first to see if it's safe." He paused. She walked toward that gate because Rex needed her. That was the whole equation. He needed her, so she went. The studio was very quiet for a moment. Rex, oblivious to the national television program and the weight of the moment and the cameras and the emotional state of every adult in the room, chose this precise instant to stand up, shake himself vigorously, walk the 3 steps to where Lily was sitting, and lie back down directly on top of her feet. Lily looked down at him. She looked up at the camera. She smiled the smile of someone who has everything she needs exactly where she needs it. And somewhere across the country, in living rooms and firehouses and kindergarten classrooms and offices and hospital waiting rooms and kitchen tables, where people were watching on their phones, something released. Something that had been held tight for a long time, in a world that had given people a great many reasons to hold things tight, quietly and gently let go. Because sometimes the most important story in the world is a small one. A backyard, a gate, a dog in trouble, and a barefoot 2-year-old girl who looked at fear and walked straight into it. Not because she was brave enough to overcome it, but because she loved enough to never feel it at all. The end.